What started as a routine historical analysis became one of the most shocking revelations about the brutal reality of slavery in the American South. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon for more incredible historical stories that will leave you speechless. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the Digital History Archive at Vanderbilt University as Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her glasses and leaned closer to her computer screen. It was October 15, 2019, and she had been working for 3 months on a project to digitize and analyze historical photographs from the antebellum South. "Another plantation portrait," she murmured to herself, opening the high-resolution scan of a daguerreotype dated 1847. The image showed what appeared to be a typical scene from a southern plantation. A well-dressed white man in his 50s, standing confidently beside a magnificent thoroughbred horse, while a young black man, clearly enslaved, held the animal's reins. Dr. Mitchell had seen hundreds of similar photographs during her career. They were common documentation of wealth and status in the pre-Civil War South. Plantation owners often commissioned such portraits to showcase their prosperity, their finest horses, their grand estates, and yes, their human property. These images served multiple purposes. They were status symbols to display in parlors, documentation for insurance purposes, and sometimes propaganda pieces to send to northern relatives who questioned the morality of slavery. The daguerreotype process itself was expensive and time-consuming, requiring subjects to remain perfectly still for several minutes, while the image was captured on a silver-plated copper sheet. The fact that this particular photograph existed at all spoke to its importance to the plantation owner who had commissioned it. The man in the center of the photograph was identified in the archive records as Colonel James Whitmore, owner of Magnolia Grove Plantation in Mississippi. He stood with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority, his hand resting on a walking stick, topped with what appeared to be a silver handle. His gaze was direct and commanding, the look of a man who had never been questioned or challenged in his own domain. His clothing spoke of wealth, a well-tailored dark coat with brass buttons, a pristine white shirt with a high collar, and polished boots that reflected the photographer's flash powder. Colonel Whitmore's face bore the weathered look of a man who spent time outdoors, supervising his vast holdings. But his hands were soft, unmarked by manual labor. His hair was carefully styled in the fashion of the day, and his mustache was precisely trimmed. Everything about his appearance had been calculated to project authority and prosperity. The horse was clearly a prized possession, a bay stallion with perfect conformation, its coat gleaming even in the sepia tones of the old photograph. Every line of the animal spoke of careful breeding and expensive care. The horse's tack was elaborate, with silver fittings that caught the light, and its mane had been carefully groomed for the photograph. This was not a working farm horse, but a show animal, bred for racing or riding, worth more than most people's annual income. But it was the third figure that drew Dr. Mitchell's attention, as it always did in these historical documents. The enslaved man appeared to be in his early 20s, his posture respectful but not servile, his eyes looking directly at the camera with an expression that seemed to hold depths of untold stories. He wore simple but clean clothing, a cotton shirt and dark trousers that marked his status as likely a house servant or skilled worker rather than a field hand. His clothing, while simple, was well maintained, suggesting he held a position of some responsibility within the plantation hierarchy. House servants often dressed better than field workers, as they were the visible representatives of their owner's wealth and status when visitors came to the plantation. His hair was neatly cut, and his bearing suggested intelligence and dignity despite his circumstances. Dr. Mitchell had been studying such photographs for her doctoral dissertation on visual documentation of slavery in the antebellum South. Each image was a window into a world of systematic oppression, but also of human resilience and dignity maintained under the most dehumanizing circumstances. She had developed a methodology for analyzing these images that went beyond their obvious content, looking for subtle details that revealed the complex relationships and power dynamics of plantation life. The setting of the photograph was carefully chosen. They stood in front of what appeared to be the main house of the plantation, with white columns visible in the background. The neoclassical architecture was typical of wealthy southern plantations, designed to evoke the grandeur of ancient Greece and Rome, while housing a system of forced labor that would have been familiar to those ancient civilizations. The photographer had positioned his subjects to create a composition that spoke to the social hierarchy of the plantation. Colonel Whitmore stood in the center, the clear focus of the image, with the horse and the enslaved man arranged around him as symbols of his wealth and power. The lighting was carefully managed to ensure that all three subjects were clearly visible, suggesting this was not a casual snapshot, but a formal portrait with specific artistic and social intentions. She began her standard analysis protocol, examining the composition, the lighting, the clothing, and the setting. The photograph had been taken in front of what appeared to be the main house of the plantation, with white columns visible in the background. The quality was exceptional for its time, suggesting the photographer was skilled, and the setting was important enough to warrant the expense of bringing a professional photographer to the remote plantation. The technical aspects of the photograph were impressive. The depth of field was carefully managed to keep all three subjects in sharp focus while allowing the background to fade slightly, drawing attention to the main subjects. The exposure was perfectly calculated to capture detail in both the bright white of Colonel Whitmore's shirt and the darker tones of the enslaved man's clothing and the horse's coat. As part of her methodology, Dr. Mitchell always examined photographs at maximum digital magnification, looking for details that might have been missed in previous analyses. She had discovered fascinating historical details this way: hidden jewelry that revealed family connections, subtle expressions that suggested relationships between subjects, background elements that told stories beyond the obvious subjects. The digital enhancement technology available to her was far superior to what previous generations of historians had access to. High-resolution scanning could reveal details invisible to the naked eye, and computer software could enhance contrast and clarity to bring out features that had been lost in the aging process of the original daguerreotype. She began with Colonel Whitmore, noting the details of his clothing, the style of his hair, the way he held himself. His walking stick was particularly interesting. The silver handle appeared to be engraved with some kind of design, possibly a family crest or personal symbol. His watch chain was visible across his vest, and she could make out what appeared to be a Masonic pin on his lapel, suggesting his involvement in the social networks that connected wealthy Southern men. Then she moved to the horse, examining the tack, the grooming, the breeding characteristics that spoke to the animal's value. The bridle was elaborate, with silver fittings that matched the owner's walking stick. The horse's conformation suggested thoroughbred breeding, possibly with bloodlines traceable to famous racing stock. The care taken in grooming the animal for the photograph was evident in every detail, from the perfectly braided mane to the polished hooves. Finally, she turned her attention to the enslaved man. As she zoomed in on his face, she was struck again by his direct gaze. There was something in his expression, not defiance exactly, but a quiet strength that refused to be diminished by his circumstances. His eyes held intelligence and awareness, suggesting a man who understood his situation but had not been broken by it. It was then that she noticed something on his left arm. Dr. Mitchell frowned and adjusted the contrast on her screen. There, just visible below the rolled-up sleeve of the man's shirt, was what appeared to be a mark on his skin. At first glance, it looked like it might be a scar, or perhaps a shadow from the lighting. The digital enhancement allowed her to see details that would have been completely invisible to historians working with physical prints. She increased the magnification further, her heart beginning to beat faster as the details became clearer. It wasn't a scar or a shadow, it was a brand. A deliberate mark burned into human flesh with a hot iron, just as livestock were marked to indicate ownership. The symbol was distinctive, two interlocking loops forming a pattern that looked almost like a figure 8 lying on its side, with small decorative flourishes at the ends. The brand was approximately 2 inches across, burned deep enough into the skin to be clearly visible even in the sepia tones of the old photograph. Dr. Mitchell had seen similar marks in her research, though never with such clarity. Plantation owners often branded their enslaved people, just as they branded their livestock, to mark ownership and prevent escape. The practice of branding enslaved people was one of slavery's most dehumanizing aspects, literally treating human beings like livestock. The brands served multiple purposes. They marked ownership, made escape more difficult by providing permanent identification, and served as a psychological tool of control, a constant reminder to the enslaved person of their status as property. But something about this particular mark nagged at her. The design seemed familiar, though she couldn't immediately place where she had seen it before. The interlocking loops were unusual. Most plantation brands were simpler designs, often just initials or basic geometric shapes. This brand showed a level of artistic sophistication that suggested it had been specially designed, possibly by a silversmith or other craftsman. She sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of what she was documenting. Here was physical evidence of one of slavery's most dehumanizing practices, preserved in stark detail by the unforgiving eye of the camera. The young man in the photograph had been marked like an animal, his very flesh bearing the symbol of his owner's claim upon his life. The emotional impact of seeing such clear evidence of branding was overwhelming. Dr. Mitchell had read countless accounts of the practice in historical documents, but seeing it captured with such clarity in a photograph brought home the brutal reality in a way that written descriptions never could. This was not an abstract historical concept. This was a real person who had endured unimaginable pain and humiliation. Dr. Mitchell saved her work and made detailed notes about the brand. She would need to research similar markings to see if she could identify the specific plantation or owner associated with this particular symbol. It was important historical documentation, another piece of evidence in the overwhelming case against the lost cause mythology that tried to romanticize the antebellum South. The lost cause narrative had long sought to minimize the brutalities of slavery, portraying it as a benevolent institution where enslaved people were well treated and content. Photographs like this one provided undeniable evidence of slavery's true nature, making it impossible to maintain such romantic illusions. As she prepared to move on to the next photograph in her queue, something made her pause. Almost on impulse, she returned to the image and began examining the horse with the same careful attention she had given to the human subjects. If Colonel Whitmore had branded his human property, it was logical that he would also brand his valuable livestock. She zoomed in on the animal's flank, looking for the kind of brand marks that were common on valuable livestock. Horses, especially expensive thoroughbreds, were almost always branded to establish ownership and prevent theft. The practice was so common that most people wouldn't even notice it in a photograph. What she found made her blood run cold. There, burned into the horse's hide with the same brutal clarity as the mark on the enslaved man's arm, was an identical symbol. The same interlocking loops, the same decorative flourishes, the same deliberate design. The brand on the horse was slightly larger, as animal brands typically were, but it was unmistakably the same pattern. Dr. Mitchell stared at her screen in shock, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The enslaved man and the horse bore the exact same brand, the same mark of ownership, the same symbol that reduced both living beings to the status of property in the eyes of their owner. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just documentation of the practice of branding. This was visual proof of the complete dehumanization that was at the heart of the slavery system. The identical treatment of human and animal, marked with the same iron for the same purpose, by the same hand. She had discovered something that would change how this photograph, and perhaps how the entire historical record of slavery, would be understood. This wasn't just documentation of wealth and status. It was a stark, undeniable visual representation of slavery's fundamental evil, the reduction of human beings to the level of livestock. The photograph suddenly took on new meaning. What had appeared to be a standard plantation portrait was actually a document of systematic dehumanization. Colonel Whitmore wasn't just displaying his wealth, he was displaying his property, marked with his personal symbol, just like any other valuable possession. With trembling hands, Dr. Mitchell reached for her phone to call her dissertation advisor. This discovery was too important to keep to herself, too significant to process alone. The rain continued to fall against the windows as she dialed, but Dr. Mitchell no longer heard it. All she could see was that terrible symbol burned into human flesh and animal hide with equal indifference, marking both as nothing more than property in the eyes of a man who believed he had the right to own other living beings. The discovery would change everything, not just her dissertation, but the entire understanding of how slavery was documented and remembered. The Whitmore Daguerreotype, as it would come to be known, would become one of the most important pieces of visual evidence about slavery's reality ever discovered. Dr. Robert Hayes answered his phone on the second ring, despite the late hour. As Dr. Mitchell's dissertation advisor and a renowned expert on slavery in the American South, he was accustomed to urgent calls from graduate students who had stumbled upon significant historical discoveries. In his 30 years of academic life, he had received dozens of such calls, though most turned out to be less groundbreaking than the excited student initially believed. "Sarah, what's got you calling at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night?" "Professor Hayes, I need you to come to the lab. I've found something. Something that changes everything about how we understand the visual documentation of slavery." The urgency in her voice was unmistakable, but it was the controlled nature of her excitement that caught his attention. Dr. Hayes had known Sarah Mitchell for 3 years, and she was not given to dramatic overstatements. She was methodical, careful, and skeptical by nature, qualities that made her an excellent historian. If she said she had found something significant, it was worth investigating. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, already reaching for his coat. The drive to the university gave Dr. Hayes time to consider what Sarah might have discovered. In recent years, digital enhancement technology had revolutionized historical research, allowing scholars to see details in old photographs that had been invisible to previous generations. Several significant discoveries had emerged from this new analytical capability, but nothing that Sarah's tone suggested she had found. When Dr. Hayes arrived at the Digital History Archive, he found Dr. Mitchell exactly where he had expected, hunched over her computer, surrounded by printouts and reference books. Her usually neat workspace was in disarray, evidence of hours of frantic research. Empty coffee cups and the remnants of a hastily eaten sandwich suggested she had been working through dinner. The archive itself was a testament to the digital revolution in historical research. Banks of high-powered computers hummed quietly, processing the massive files created by scanning historical documents at resolutions that captured every detail of the original. The room was kept at a constant temperature and humidity to protect the equipment, giving it an almost clinical atmosphere that seemed appropriate for the serious work conducted there. "Show me what you found," he said without preamble. Dr. Mitchell turned her screen toward him, displaying the 1847 daguerreotype at maximum magnification, focused on the enslaved man's branded arm. The detail was extraordinary. Every line of the brand was clearly visible, burned into the skin with precise, deliberate strokes. "This is from the Whitmore plantation in Mississippi," she began, her voice steady despite her obvious excitement. "At first I thought I was just documenting another example of human branding, which is significant enough, but then I looked at the horse." She clicked to another view, showing the identical brand on the animal's flank. The two images side by side created a visual impact that was both immediate and devastating. Dr. Hayes leaned forward, his experienced eye immediately grasping the implications. In 30 years of studying slavery, he had seen countless examples of the brutal practices used to mark and control enslaved people. He had read testimonies, examined scars on preserved human remains, and studied the tools used for branding. But he had never seen such clear photographic evidence of the identical treatment of humans and animals. "My God," he whispered, "they're exactly the same." "Down to the smallest detail," Dr. Mitchell confirmed. "I've been researching the symbol for the past 4 hours. It's definitely Colonel Whitmore's personal brand. I found references to it in plantation records and slave auction documents. He used this mark on all his property, livestock, equipment, and people." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just evidence of branding, it was proof of the complete philosophical framework that allowed slavery to exist. The identical treatment of human and animal revealed the mindset that made such a system possible. Dr. Hayes studied the image more closely, his historian's mind already working through the implications. "The clarity is remarkable. You can see every detail of the branding iron's work. This isn't just historical documentation, it's evidence. Evidence of what, exactly? Dr. Mitchell asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Evidence of the complete dehumanization that was at the heart of the slavery system. Doctor, Hayes replied, we've always known intellectually that enslaved people were treated as property, but this photograph shows it literally. The same mark, applied with the same tools, for the same purpose, to establish ownership. The academic language seemed inadequate to describe what they were seeing. This was more than historical documentation. It was a window into a mindset so alien to modern sensibilities that it was difficult to comprehend how human beings could have participated in such a system. Dr. Mitchell pulled up another document on her screen, a page from a plantation ledger she had found in the Mississippi State Archives' digital collection. The archives had been digitizing their collections for years, making previously inaccessible documents available to researchers around the world. Look at this, she said. It's from Whitmore's plantation records dated 1846. He lists his property acquisitions for that year. Dr. Hayes read the entries aloud. 1 bay stallion, 3 years old, branded with a state mark. Purchased from Lexington stables for $800. 1 Negro boy, approximately 20 years old, branded with state mark. Purchased from Alabama plantation for $600. They're listed in the same category, with the same notation about branding. The clinical language of the ledger entry was somehow more chilling than any emotional description could have been. The matter-of-fact recording of human beings alongside livestock, both reduced to mere inventory items, spoke to a system so thoroughly normalized that its practitioners saw nothing unusual in such documentation. The monetary values were particularly striking. The horse was worth more than the human being, a calculation that revealed the economic logic that drove the slavery system. Both were investments, both were property, both were marked with the same brand to establish ownership. Have you been able to identify the individuals in the photograph? Dr. Hayes asked. I'm working on it. The plantation records are incomplete, but I think the enslaved man might be someone named Samuel. There are references to a Samuel house servant, branded 1846, in several documents. The timing would be right. He would have been newly branded when this photograph was taken. The process of identifying enslaved people in historical records was always challenging. Most were known only by first names, and record-keeping was often haphazard. But the brand provided a unique identifier that might make it possible to trace Samuel's story through the documentary record. Dr. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. What about the horse? The stallion was named Aristocrat according to the breeding records. Whitmore paid $800 for him in 1846, a fortune at the time. The same records show that Samuel was purchased for $600. The monetary comparison hung in the air between them, another stark reminder of the economic calculations that reduced human beings to market commodities. A horse worth more than a man, both marked with the same symbol of ownership. The breeding records for Aristocrat were extensive, documenting his bloodline back several generations to famous racing stock. The care taken in maintaining these records contrasted sharply with the sparse documentation of Samuel's background, reflecting the different values placed on human and animal property. Sarah, this discovery has implications beyond your dissertation, Dr. Hayes said slowly. This photograph could become one of the most important pieces of visual evidence we have about the reality of slavery. But we need to be absolutely certain of our facts before we publish anything. The responsibility was enormous. Historical discoveries of this magnitude required careful verification and thoughtful presentation. The potential for misinterpretation or sensationalism was high, and they had an obligation to handle the discovery with the gravity it deserved. Dr. Mitchell nodded. I've been thinking the same thing. I want to bring in Dr. Jennifer Washington from the African American Studies Department. Her expertise in slavery documentation could help us verify the historical context. Dr. Washington was one of the leading experts on slavery in the Mississippi Delta region. Her work on plantation records and slave narratives had established her as an authority on the documentary evidence of slavery's impact on African American families and communities. Good idea. And we should consult with the photography experts at the Smithsonian. We need to be absolutely certain about the authenticity and dating of this image. Authentication would be crucial. The discovery was so significant that skeptics would inevitably question its authenticity. They needed to be able to prove beyond any doubt that the photograph was genuine and from the period it claimed to represent. As they spoke, Dr. Mitchell continued to examine the photograph, zooming in on different sections, looking for additional details that might have been missed. The more she studied it, the more the image revealed about the brutal realities of plantation life. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a barely visible detail in the background. "You can see other enslaved people in the distance, working in what appears to be a cotton field, and here near the house there's what looks like an overseer with a whip." Dr. Hayes squinted at the screen. The digital enhancement had revealed details that would have been completely invisible in a physical print. In the far background, tiny figures could be seen bent over in the cotton fields, their postures speaking to the backbreaking labor that was the foundation of the plantation's wealth. The level of detail is extraordinary. This photographer was documenting more than he probably realized. This single image captures the entire power structure of a plantation, the owner displaying his wealth and authority, the enslaved people reduced to the status of property, the tools of control and violence. The composition of the photograph suddenly seemed more deliberate. What had appeared to be a simple portrait was actually a comprehensive documentation of the plantation system, with every element carefully arranged to display the owner's power and wealth. "There's something else," Dr. Mitchell said, her voice dropping. "I've been researching what happened to Samuel after this photograph was taken." She pulled up another document, a slave auction notice from 1849, printed in a New Orleans newspaper. The language was clinical and dehumanizing, describing human beings in the same terms used for livestock. Whitmore sold him 2 years later. The auction notice specifically mentions the brand as a form of identification. Negro boy Samuel, approximately 22 years old, bearing the Whitmore estate mark on left arm. Dr. Hayes felt a chill as he read the notice. Here was the human cost of the system they were studying. A young man torn from whatever life he had managed to build, sold like livestock to another owner, his branded flesh serving as a permanent reminder of his status as property. The auction notice provided additional details about Samuel's skills and physical condition, information that would have been important to potential buyers. He was described as intelligent and well-trained in house service, suggesting he had developed valuable skills during his time at the Whitmore plantation. "Do we know what happened to him after that?" Dr. Hayes asked. "I'm still researching. Slave records from that period are fragmentary at best. But I did find something interesting. There's a Samuel listed in the 1870 census as a freedman living in Jackson, Mississippi. He would have been about the right age. If it's the same person, he survived slavery and was still alive 5 years after emancipation." The possibility that Samuel had lived to see freedom added a note of hope to their grim research, but it also raised new questions. What had those years of slavery been like for him? How had he coped with bearing the permanent mark of his former owner? What had freedom meant to someone who had been literally branded as property? "We need to approach this research with the gravity it deserves," Dr. Hayes said. "This isn't just an academic exercise. We're dealing with real people who suffered real trauma." Samuel, if he survived, would have carried that brand for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of his years in bondage. Dr. Mitchell nodded solemnly. "I've been thinking about that. Every time he looked at his arm, every time someone saw that mark, he would have been reminded of what had been done to him. The branding wasn't just about marking property. It was about psychological control, about making sure enslaved people could never forget their status. The psychological impact of branding was something that historians were only beginning to understand. The physical pain of the branding iron was temporary, but the psychological trauma lasted a lifetime. The brand served as a constant reminder of powerlessness, of being reduced to the status of an object. As the evening wore on, the two historians continued their analysis, each new detail adding to their understanding of the photograph's significance. They were not just looking at a historical document, they were witnessing one of the most powerful pieces of evidence ever captured about the dehumanizing reality of American slavery. The identical brands on Samuel's arm and aristocrat's flank would become a symbol that spoke louder than any written account of slavery's brutality. In the stark clarity of the daguerreotype, there was no room for romanticization or denial. Here was the truth, burned into flesh and preserved for posterity by the unforgiving eye of the camera. The discovery would require months of additional research to fully understand its implications, but already Dr. Hayes could see that this photograph would change how slavery was taught and remembered. The visual evidence was too powerful to ignore, too clear to misinterpret. As they prepared to leave the archive that night, both historians understood that they had stumbled upon something that would define their careers and contribute significantly to the historical understanding of slavery's reality. The young man in the photograph, branded like an animal but maintaining his dignity despite his circumstances, had become their guide into one of the darkest chapters of American history. 3 weeks after Dr. Mitchell's initial discovery, the small conference room at Vanderbilt University buzzed with quiet intensity. The team that had assembled to verify and analyze the photograph represented some of the most respected voices in American historical scholarship, each bringing decades of expertise to bear on this extraordinary discovery. Dr. Jennifer Washington from African American Studies sat across from Dr. Mitchell, her laptop open to genealogical databases and slave documentation that she had spent years compiling. Her work on tracing enslaved families through fragmentary records had made her one of the leading experts in the field, and her presence lent credibility to their investigation. Dr. Marcus Thompson, a photography expert from the Smithsonian Institution, had driven down from Washington, D.C. with specialized equipment to authenticate the daguerreotype. His reputation for detecting photographic forgeries and dating historical images was unparalleled, and his analysis would be crucial to establishing the photograph's authenticity. Dr. Hayes presided over the meeting, his decades of experience lending gravity to the proceedings. The walls of the conference room were lined with books on Southern history, slavery, and historical methodology, creating an atmosphere of serious scholarship that matched the importance of their discovery. "Let's start with authentication," Dr. Hayes said, turning to Dr. Thompson. "Can we be absolutely certain this photograph is genuine and from the period it claims to be?" Dr. Thompson adjusted his glasses and consulted his notes, which were filled with technical details about photographic processes and chemical analysis. "I've completed a comprehensive analysis of the daguerreotype, the silver-plated copper, the mercury amalgam process, the specific chemical signatures. Everything is consistent with mid-1840s photography. The paper backing, the case, even the brass mat are period appropriate. This is definitely an authentic 1847 daguerreotype." He pulled up a detailed technical analysis on his laptop, showing microscopic images of the photograph's surface. More importantly, there are no signs of digital manipulation or modern alteration. The brands visible on both the human subject and the horse were present when this image was originally captured. The aging patterns, the chemical degradation, the way the silver has tarnished, all of it is consistent with a photograph that's over 170 years old. The technical analysis was crucial. In an age of sophisticated digital manipulation, any historical discovery of this magnitude would face skepticism about its authenticity. Dr. Thompson's analysis provided the scientific foundation that would allow their findings to withstand scrutiny. Dr. Washington leaned forward, her expression serious. "I've been working on identifying the individuals in the photograph. The plantation records are more complete than we initially thought. I can now confirm that the enslaved man is indeed Samuel, last name unknown, as was common for enslaved people. He was purchased by Colonel Whitmore in March 1846 for $600 from a plantation in Alabama." She opened a folder containing photocopies of historical documents, each one a piece of the puzzle that was Samuel's life. "Here's the bill of sale. It specifically notes that Samuel was branded with the Whitmore estate mark upon purchase. The branding was done as a matter of routine. Whitmore branded all his newly acquired human property within days of purchase." Dr. Mitchell felt her stomach tighten as she looked at the clinical language of the bill of sale. The document described Samuel's physical characteristics, his estimated age, his skills as a house servant, and his branding as if he were livestock being processed for a farm. The dehumanizing language was stark and uncompromising. The bill of sale provides additional details about Samuel's background, Dr. Washington continued. He was described as intelligent and well-trained in house service, suggesting he had valuable skills. The seller noted that he was of good character and not given to running away, which was important information for potential buyers. The language of the slave market revealed the complex calculations that went into human trafficking. Samuel's intelligence and skills made him more valuable, but they also made him potentially more dangerous to his owners. The notation about not running away was crucial. Escaped slaves represented a significant financial loss. What about his background before Whitmore purchased him? Dr. Hayes asked. That's where the story becomes even more tragic, Dr. Washington replied, her voice heavy with emotion. I traced the previous bill of sale. Samuel was born on a plantation in Virginia around 1825. He was sold away from his family when he was about 15 years old, first to the Alabama plantation, then to Whitmore 5 years later. By the time this photograph was taken, he had already been branded twice, once by each owner. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Samuel had not only endured the trauma of being branded like an animal, but he had experienced it multiple times as he was sold from owner to owner, each one marking him as property. The psychological impact of such repeated dehumanization was almost impossible to comprehend. The practice of multiple branding was more common than most people realize, Dr. Washington explained. Each time an enslaved person was sold, the new owner would often apply their own brand, sometimes over the old one, sometimes in a different location. Samuel's body would have borne the scars of multiple owners. The image of Samuel's scarred flesh, marked repeatedly by different owners, created a visceral understanding of slavery's brutality that no textbook description could match. Each brand represented not just physical pain, but the psychological trauma of being reduced to property, of having one's humanity denied in the most literal way possible. The horse has a simpler but no less telling story, Dr. Washington continued. Aristocrat was bred in Kentucky and purchased by Whitmore specifically for this photograph. The colonel was known for commissioning portraits to document his wealth and status. This particular photograph was likely intended to showcase his finest possessions, his prize stallion, and his most presentable house servant. The deliberate nature of the photograph's composition became clearer. This wasn't a casual snapshot, but a carefully planned documentation of wealth and power. Colonel Whitmore had arranged his most valuable possessions, human and animal, to create a visual statement about his status and authority. Dr. Thompson pulled up the enhanced image on the main screen, pointing out details that supported this interpretation. The technical quality of this photograph is exceptional for its time. The photographer, based on the style and technique, was likely J.H. Fitzgibbon, who was known for his plantation portraits. The lighting, composition, and clarity suggest this was an expensive commission. Fitzgibbon was one of the most skilled daguerreotypists working in the South during the 1840s. His portraits of wealthy plantation owners were prized for their technical excellence and artistic composition. The fact that Whitmore had hired such a skilled photographer suggested the importance he placed on this particular image, which makes the visibility of the brands even more significant, Dr. Mitchell added. This wasn't an accidental capture of something Whitmore wanted to hide. The brands are clearly visible, suggesting he saw them as natural and unremarkable, just part of the normal order of his world. The casual display of the brands revealed the mindset that made slavery possible. To Whitmore, the marks on Samuel's arm and Aristocrat's flank were simply practical necessities, no different from the serial numbers on his other valuable possessions. The fact that one of those possessions was a human being apparently caused him no moral discomfort. Dr. Hayes studied the image again, noting details he had missed in previous examinations. The positioning is deliberate. Samuel is holding the horse's reins, but he's also positioned so that his branded arm is clearly visible. Whitmore is standing in a position of authority over both his human and animal property. The composition tells a story about power, ownership, and control. The photographer's skill was evident in how he had arranged the subjects to create a visual hierarchy. Whitmore dominated the center of the frame, with Samuel and Aristocrat arranged as supporting elements that enhanced his status. The branded arm and flank were positioned to catch the light, making the marks clearly visible to anyone viewing the photograph. Dr. Washington had been quietly working on her laptop during the discussion. Now she looked up with an expression of mixed triumph and sorrow. "I found him," she said quietly. "I found what happened to Samuel after he was sold in 1849. The room's attention focused on her immediately. The fate of enslaved people after they disappeared from plantation records was usually lost to history, making any trace of Samuel's later life extraordinarily valuable. He was purchased by a plantation owner named Robert Crawford in Louisiana. The records show he worked there until emancipation in 1865. But here's what's remarkable. I found him in the 1870 census living as a freedman in New Orleans." She turned her laptop screen toward the group, showing a digitized census page. "Samuel Johnson. He took the surname Johnson after emancipation, probably after the Freedmen's Bureau agent who helped him register. He was working as a carpenter and living with a woman named Mary and 2 children. Dr. Mitchell felt tears welling in her eyes. He survived. He made it to freedom." The discovery that Samuel had lived to see emancipation transformed their understanding of the photograph. This wasn't just documentation of victimization, but the story of a survivor who had endured unimaginable dehumanization and lived to claim his freedom. "Not only that," Dr. Washington continued, her voice gaining strength, "but I found a record of him testifying before a congressional committee in 1871 about his experiences under slavery. His testimony was part of the investigation into Ku Klux Klan violence in the South." She pulled up a digitized copy of congressional records, the pages yellowed with age, but the text still clearly legible. "Listen to this. It's Samuel's own words. 'I bear the marks of 2 masters on my body. They branded me like I was a horse or a cow, but I am a man, and no mark can change that. I survived to tell this story so that people will know what slavery really was.'" The power of Samuel's words, spoken more than 150 years ago but preserved in the congressional record, filled the room with emotion. Here was the voice of the young man in the photograph, speaking across the centuries about his experience of dehumanization and his ultimate triumph over it. "This changes everything about how we understand this photograph," Dr. Hayes said slowly. "It's not just documentation of slavery's brutality, it's a testament to human resilience. Samuel survived, found freedom, started a family, and made sure his story was recorded for history." The congressional testimony provided crucial context for understanding the photograph. Samuel's words revealed not just what had been done to him, but how he had processed and overcome those experiences. His insistence on his humanity, "I am a man, and no mark can change that," became a powerful counterpoint to the dehumanization represented by the brands. Dr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "From a historical documentation perspective, this photograph has become invaluable. We have the visual evidence, the contemporary records, and the survivor's own testimony. It's one of the most complete pictures of slavery's reality that we've ever assembled. The convergence of visual, documentary, and testimonial evidence created an unprecedented window into the slavery experience. Most historical research relied on fragmentary evidence, but this discovery provided multiple perspectives on the same events and individuals. But we have a responsibility to handle this discovery appropriately," Dr. Washington added. "This isn't just an academic finding, it's Samuel's story, and it's the story of millions of people who were branded, sold, and treated as property. We need to tell it with the dignity and respect that Samuel and others like him deserve." The ethical dimensions of their discovery were complex. They had an obligation to share this important historical evidence, but they also had a responsibility to honor the memory of the people whose suffering it documented. Samuel's own words provided guidance. He had wanted his story told so that people would understand slavery's reality. Dr. Mitchell looked again at the photograph, but now she saw it differently. The young man holding the horse's reins was no longer just a historical subject. He was Samuel Johnson, a man who had endured unimaginable dehumanization but had survived to claim his freedom and tell his story. "What's our next step?" she asked. Dr. Hayes considered the question carefully. We publish our findings, but we do it right. We tell Samuel's complete story, not just his suffering, but his survival and his testimony. We use this photograph to educate people about slavery's reality, but we also use it to honor the resilience of people like Samuel who refused to let that system destroy their humanity. And we make sure this image is preserved and accessible, Dr. Thompson added. This photograph needs to be in museums, textbooks, and educational materials. It's too important to remain buried in archives. The team spent the rest of the afternoon planning their research publication and considering how to present their findings to both academic and public audiences. The photograph would need to be contextualized carefully, with Samuel's story told in full to honor both his suffering and his survival. As the meeting concluded, the team members sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the weight of their discovery. They had uncovered more than just a historical photograph. They had found a window into one of the darkest chapters of American history, but also a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. The identical brands on Samuel's arm and aristocrat's flank would indeed become a powerful symbol, but not just of slavery's brutality. They would also represent the triumph of human dignity over systematic dehumanization, and the importance of preserving and telling the stories of those who survived to claim their freedom. Samuel Johnson's voice, speaking from the congressional records of 1871, would have the last word. I am a man, and no mark can change that. 6 months after the discovery, the photograph had become one of the most discussed historical documents in America. The image, now known as the Whitmore Daguerreotype, was featured in museums from the Smithsonian to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. But its impact extended far beyond academic circles, sparking conversations about historical memory, racial justice, and the ongoing legacy of slavery in American society. Dr. Mitchell stood before a packed auditorium at the annual conference of the American Historical Association, preparing to deliver what many considered the most important presentation on slavery documentation in decades. The audience included historians, educators, museum curators, and descendants of enslaved people who had traveled from across the country to hear Samuel's story. The presentation had been moved to the largest auditorium available, and even then, hundreds of people were watching via live stream. When I first examined this photograph, Dr. Mitchell began, I thought I was simply documenting another example of antebellum plantation life. I had no idea I was about to uncover one of the most powerful pieces of evidence about slavery's dehumanizing reality, and more importantly, about the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit. The enhanced image appeared on the screen behind her, showing the identical brands with stark clarity. A murmur went through the audience. Even those who had read about the discovery were struck by the visual impact of seeing the evidence firsthand. The silence that followed was profound, as hundreds of people absorbed the implications of what they were seeing. The identical brands on Samuel's arm and aristocrat's flank represent more than just historical documentation, Dr. Mitchell continued. They represent a system so thoroughly dehumanizing that it literally reduced human beings to the status of livestock. But they also represent something else, the survival of human dignity in the face of systematic oppression. In the front row, an elderly African-American woman named Dorothy Williams listened intently. She had contacted Dr. Mitchell 3 months earlier with an extraordinary claim. She believed Samuel Johnson was her great-great-grandfather. DNA testing and genealogical research had confirmed her family connection, making her Samuel's direct descendant and adding a personal dimension to the historical discovery. My family always knew our ancestor had been enslaved, Dorothy had told Dr. Mitchell during their first meeting. But we never knew the details. We never knew about the branding or about his testimony to Congress. This photograph has given us back a piece of our history that we thought was lost forever. The meeting with Dorothy had been emotional for everyone involved. She had brought family photographs, documents, and stories that had been passed down through generations. The connection between the young man in the 1847 daguerreotype and the thriving family that descended from him provided a powerful testament to survival and resilience. Now, as Dr. Mitchell continued her presentation, Dorothy thought about the family stories that had been passed down through generations, stories of an ancestor who had been marked but who had survived to build a new life in freedom. The photograph had transformed those vague family memories into documented history, giving concrete form to stories that had been preserved only in oral tradition. The discovery of Samuel's congressional testimony was perhaps even more significant than the photograph itself, Dr. Mitchell explained to the audience. In his own words, he refused to let the branding define him. He said, "I am a man, and no mark can change that." Those words, spoken in 1871, resonate just as powerfully today. The congressional testimony had provided crucial insight into how Samuel had processed his experiences. His words revealed not just what had been done to him, but how he had maintained his sense of humanity despite systematic attempts to destroy it. The testimony had become a powerful counterpoint to the visual evidence of dehumanization. Dr. Washington, who was co-presenting, took over the presentation. Samuel's story doesn't end with emancipation. Our research shows that he lived until 1892, working as a carpenter and community leader in New Orleans. He and his wife Mary raised 4 children, all of whom received educations that had been denied to their father. Samuel's descendants include teachers, doctors, business owners, and community leaders. The audience was silent, absorbing the full arc of Samuel's life, from branded slave to free man to patriarch of a family that had thrived for generations. The transformation from property to person to ancestor created a narrative of triumph that balanced the horror of the original photograph. This photograph has become a teaching tool in schools across the country, Dr. Mitchell continued. But we've been careful to present it not just as evidence of slavery's brutality, but as a testament to human resilience. Students don't just learn about the branding. They learn about Samuel's survival, his testimony, and his family's success in freedom. The educational impact of the photograph had indeed been profound. Teachers reported that students who saw the image understood slavery's reality in a way that textbook descriptions had never achieved. The visual evidence was undeniable and immediate. There was no room for the romanticization that sometimes crept into discussions of the antebellum South, but educators had been careful to follow Dr. Mitchell's team's guidance in presenting the complete story. Students learned about Samuel's suffering, but they also learned about his strength, his survival, and his determination to ensure that his story was recorded for future generations. The photograph became a starting point for discussions about resilience, dignity, and the power of bearing witness to historical truth. The photograph has also sparked important conversations about historical memory and how we remember slavery, Dr. Washington added. For too long, the visual record of slavery was dominated by romanticized images that obscured its brutal reality. This photograph cuts through that mythology with undeniable clarity. Museum curators had reported similar impacts. Visitors to exhibits featuring the photograph often spent long periods studying the image, many becoming emotional as they grasped its implications. The identical brands served as a powerful symbol that needed no explanation. The dehumanization was immediately apparent to anyone who looked at the image. The photograph had also influenced how other historical images were interpreted. Museums began re-examining their collections of plantation photographs, looking for similar evidence that might have been overlooked. Several additional examples of branding were discovered, though none with the clarity and completeness of the Whitmore daguerreotype. As the presentation concluded, Dr. Mitchell introduced Dorothy Williams to the audience. The elderly woman stood slowly, her dignity evident in every movement. At 83, she carried herself with the grace of someone who had lived through the civil rights movement and understood the importance of bearing witness to history. "My great-great-grandfather Samuel was branded like an animal," she said, her voice strong despite her age. "But he was not an animal. He was a man who survived, who built a family, who made sure his story was told. This photograph doesn't just show his suffering, it shows his strength." She paused, looking out at the audience of historians and educators. Samuel said he bore the marks of 2 masters on his body, but he also said he was a man and no mark could change that. I want you to remember that when you teach about this photograph. Don't just show the brands, tell the whole story. Show that we survived, show that we thrived. The standing ovation that followed was not just for Dorothy Williams, but for Samuel Johnson and the millions of enslaved people whose stories had been lost to history. The Whitmore Daguerreotype had given voice to their experiences in a way that no written account could match. Dorothy's presence at the conference had added a crucial dimension to the discovery. She represented the living legacy of slavery, the continuation of families and communities that had survived despite systematic attempts to destroy them. Her great-great-grandfather's branded arm had become a symbol not just of suffering but of survival. In the months that followed, the photograph continued to generate discussion and research. Other historians began examining their collections more carefully, looking for similar evidence that might have been overlooked. Several additional examples of identical branding of humans and animals were discovered, confirming that the Whitmore plantation was not unique in this practice. The photograph also sparked broader conversations about historical preservation and the importance of digital enhancement in historical research. Dr. Mitchell's careful analysis had revealed details that had been invisible to previous generations of historians, demonstrating the value of new technologies in uncovering historical truth. Universities began incorporating the photograph into their curricula, using it as a case study in historical methodology, as well as evidence of slavery's reality. The discovery had shown how careful analysis of visual evidence could reveal new insights into well-documented historical periods. But perhaps the most important legacy of the discovery was its impact on how slavery was taught and remembered. The photograph had become a powerful tool for educators who wanted to convey the reality of slavery without relying on sensationalism or exploitation. The image spoke for itself, requiring no dramatic interpretation or emotional manipulation. Samuel Johnson's congressional testimony, rediscovered as part of the research into the photograph, was also being incorporated into educational materials. His words provided a first-person account of slavery's impact that complemented the visual evidence of the photograph. The combination of image and testimony created an unprecedented window into the slavery experience. "I survived to tell this story so that people will know what slavery really was," Samuel had said in 1871. More than 150 years later, his story was indeed being told, reaching audiences he could never have imagined. The photograph had become the vehicle for his testimony, carrying his words and his image into classrooms, museums, and homes around the world. The Whitmore Daguerreotype had become more than just a historical document. It was a bridge between past and present, connecting Samuel Johnson's experience to contemporary understanding of slavery's legacy. The identical brands that had once marked him as property had become symbols of his humanity and resilience. The discovery had also influenced ongoing discussions about reparations and racial justice. The visual evidence of slavery's dehumanizing practices provided powerful support for arguments about the lasting impact of historical injustices. The photograph made abstract discussions about slavery's legacy concrete and immediate. As Dr. Mitchell often said in her presentations, "This photograph shows us the worst of what humans can do to each other, but it also shows us the best, the unbreakable spirit that refuses to be diminished by even the most dehumanizing treatment." Samuel Johnson, the young man who had stood holding a horse's reins in a Mississippi plantation in 1847, had finally received the recognition he deserved. His story, preserved in silver and mercury on a copper plate, would continue to educate and inspire future generations about both the horrors of slavery and the triumph of the human spirit. The mark that was meant to reduce him to property had instead become a symbol of his enduring humanity. Proof that, as he had said so powerfully, no mark could change the fundamental truth of what he was: a man. 2 years after the initial discovery, the Whitmore Daguerreotype had fundamentally changed how historians, educators, and the public understood the visual documentation of slavery. The photograph had traveled to museums around the world, been featured in documentaries, and become a central piece of evidence in ongoing discussions about historical memory and racial justice. Dr. Mitchell, now recognized as one of the leading experts on slavery documentation, found herself at the center of a growing movement to re-examine historical photographs with new analytical techniques. Her methodology had been adopted by researchers around the globe, leading to dozens of new discoveries that revealed previously hidden details about slavery's reality. The success of her research had led to a prestigious fellowship at the Smithsonian Institution, where she was leading a comprehensive project to digitally enhance and analyze the museum's entire collection of slavery-related photographs. The project, funded by a major foundation grant, represented the largest systematic analysis of slavery imagery ever undertaken. What we've learned from the Whitmore Daguerreotype is that these historical photographs contain far more information than we previously realized, Dr. Mitchell explained to a group of international scholars who had gathered at the Smithsonian to learn her techniques. Digital enhancement technology allows us to see details that were invisible to previous generations of historians, but more importantly, it allows us to hear voices that were silenced by the historical record. The international interest in her work had been overwhelming. Scholars from universities in Europe, Africa, and South America had come to study her methods, hoping to apply similar techniques to their own collections of historical photographs. The discovery had demonstrated that visual evidence could provide insights that written records could not match. In Brazil, researchers had used Dr. Mitchell's techniques to analyze photographs from coffee plantations, revealing similar evidence of branding and dehumanization. In the Caribbean, scholars had discovered new details about sugar plantation life that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. The methodology was proving applicable to understanding slavery and forced labor systems around the world. Dorothy Williams, now 85, had become an unexpected celebrity in her own right. Her connection to Samuel Johnson had made her a sought-after speaker at universities, museums, and community organizations. She had used her platform to advocate for better preservation of African American family histories and to encourage other families to research their own connections to enslaved ancestors. Samuel's story isn't just my family's story, she often told audiences. It's the story of millions of families who were torn apart by slavery, but who found ways to survive and rebuild. Every family has stories like this, if we take the time to look for them. Dorothy's advocacy had led to the creation of a new initiative at the National Archives to digitize and make accessible records related to enslaved people and their descendants. The Samuel Johnson Project, named in honor of her great-great-grandfather, was working to create a comprehensive database that would help families trace their ancestry back through the slavery period. The project had already helped hundreds of families discover information about their enslaved ancestors. Many had found documentation they never knew existed, bills of sale, plantation records, and even photographs that revealed details about their family histories. The emotional impact of these discoveries was profound, as families reclaimed pieces of their past that had been lost for generations. Meanwhile, the original Whitmore Daguerreotype had found a permanent home in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where it anchored a major exhibition on the reality of slavery, visual evidence, and survivor testimony. The exhibition combined the photograph with Samuel's congressional testimony, creating a powerful multimedia experience that educated visitors about both the brutality of slavery and the resilience of those who survived it. The museum reported that visitors often spent more than an hour in the exhibition, many becoming emotional as they absorbed the full impact of Samuel's story. The combination of visual evidence and first-person testimony created an immediacy that made the historical experience feel present and real. Dr. Washington had continued her research into Samuel's life, uncovering additional details about his experiences after emancipation. She had found records showing that he had been active in Republican politics during Reconstruction, serving as a delegate to local political conventions and advocating for civil rights and education for formerly enslaved people. Samuel didn't just survive slavery, Dr. Washington explained in a recent academic paper. He became a leader in his community, using his experiences to advocate for justice and equality. His congressional testimony was just one example of his lifelong commitment to ensuring that the truth about slavery was preserved and understood. The research had also revealed that Samuel had been instrumental in establishing one of the first schools for African American children in New Orleans. He had used his carpentry skills to help build the schoolhouse and had served on the school board for more than a decade. His commitment to education reflected his understanding that knowledge and literacy were crucial tools for maintaining freedom. Samuel's descendants had thrived in the generations following his death. His children had all received educations, and his grandchildren had become teachers, doctors, and business owners. The family had maintained strong connections to their ancestors' story, passing down both the trauma and the triumph of his experiences. Dr. Thompson's authentication work had led to new standards for verifying historical photographs. His techniques had been adopted by museums and archives around the world, helping to establish the authenticity of countless historical images. The rigorous scientific approach he had developed for analyzing the Whitmore daguerreotype had become the gold standard for photographic authentication. The discovery taught us that we can't take any historical photograph at face value, Dr. Thompson explained. Every image contains layers of information that require careful analysis to understand. The technology exists to reveal these hidden details, but it requires expertise and patience to interpret what we find. The impact on education had been particularly significant. The photograph had been incorporated into curricula at every level, from elementary school through graduate programs. Teachers reported that students who encountered Samuel's story developed a deeper understanding of both slavery's reality and the importance of historical preservation. High school students in particular had responded powerfully to the photograph. Many had initiated their own research projects, looking for similar evidence in their local historical collections. Several had discovered important historical documents that had been overlooked by previous researchers, demonstrating the value of fresh eyes and new perspectives in historical research. The photograph had also influenced popular culture, inspiring documentaries, books, and even a feature film that told Samuel's story. While Dr. Mitchell and her colleagues had been careful to maintain control over how the image was used, they had also recognized the importance of reaching broader audiences with Samuel's message. Samuel wanted his story told so that people would understand what slavery really was. Dr. Mitchell often reminded those who sought to use the photograph. We have an obligation to honor that intention, while also ensuring that his story is told with accuracy and respect. The documentary that featured the photograph had won several awards and had been viewed by millions of people around the world. The film had been particularly effective in reaching younger audiences who might not otherwise encounter detailed information about slavery's reality. The visual impact of the photograph, combined with dramatic readings of Samuel's testimony, had created a powerful educational tool. International scholars had begun applying Dr. Mitchell's analytical techniques to photographs from other historical contexts. Researchers studying apartheid in South Africa had discovered new evidence about the treatment of black South Africans. Scholars examining the Holocaust had found previously unnoticed details in concentration camp photographs. The methodology was proving applicable to understanding systematic oppression in many different contexts. The success of the research had also led to increased funding for digital preservation projects. Foundations and government agencies had recognized the value of digitizing historical collections and making them accessible to researchers around the world. The Whitmore daguerreotype had demonstrated that important discoveries could emerge from careful analysis of materials that had been sitting in archives for decades. Dr. Hayes, now nearing retirement, often reflected on how the discovery had changed his understanding of his own field. "In 40 years of studying slavery, I thought I had seen everything," he said in a recent interview. "But this photograph taught me that there are always new discoveries waiting to be made, new voices waiting to be heard." Samuel's story reminds us that history is not just about the past. It's about understanding how the past continues to shape our present. The photograph had also influenced ongoing legal and political discussions about reparations for slavery. The visual evidence of slavery's dehumanizing practices had been cited in congressional hearings and legal briefs arguing for compensation for the descendants of enslaved people. The image provided concrete evidence of the systematic nature of slavery's brutality that was difficult to dispute or minimize. Legal scholars had noted that the photograph represented a new type of evidence in discussions about historical injustices. Unlike written documents, which could be dismissed as biased or incomplete, the photographic evidence was immediate and undeniable. The identical brands on Samuel's arm and the horse's flank spoke to the systematic nature of dehumanization in ways that no written account could match. As the third anniversary of the discovery approached, Dr. Mitchell was preparing a comprehensive book about the photograph and its impact. The book would tell Samuel's complete story, from his birth in Virginia, through his survival of slavery, to his leadership in the post-emancipation period. It would also examine the broader implications of the discovery for understanding slavery and its legacy. Samuel's story is ultimately about the triumph of human dignity over systematic oppression. Dr. Mitchell wrote in the book's introduction, "The brands that were meant to reduce him to property became symbols of his humanity and resilience. His voice, preserved in congressional testimony and now amplified by this photograph, continues to speak truth to power more than 150 years after his death." The book would include contributions from Dorothy Williams and other descendants of enslaved people, ensuring that the contemporary impact of the discovery was documented alongside its historical significance. It would also feature technical analysis from Dr. Thompson and genealogical research from Dr. Washington, creating a comprehensive record of how the discovery had been made and verified. Plans were also underway for a traveling exhibition that would bring the photograph and Samuel's story to communities around the country. The exhibition would include interactive elements that would allow visitors to explore the photograph in detail and to learn about the research techniques that had revealed its secrets. The traveling exhibition would also include materials about other discoveries that had emerged from Dr. Mitchell's research methodology. Dozens of photographs had been reanalyzed using her techniques, revealing new details about slavery, Reconstruction, and the early civil rights movement. The exhibition would demonstrate how careful analysis of visual evidence could continue to reveal new insights about American history. Samuel Johnson's legacy had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined when Dr. Mitchell first noticed the mark on his arm. His story had become a symbol of survival and resistance, a testament to the power of bearing witness to historical truth. The photograph that had once documented his dehumanization had become a powerful tool for education and advocacy. The mark that Colonel Whitmore had burned into Samuel's flesh as a symbol of ownership had been transformed into a symbol of humanity and resilience. Samuel's own words, "I am a man, and no mark can change that," had become a rallying cry for those working to preserve and honor the stories of enslaved people and their descendants. As Dr. Mitchell often concluded her presentations, Samuel survived to tell his story so that people would know what slavery really was. Our job is to make sure his voice continues to be heard, that his story continues to educate and inspire, and that his message about the unbreakable nature of human dignity reaches every generation. The Whitmore Daguerreotype had become more than a historical document. It was a bridge between past and present, a reminder that the voices of the past still had important lessons to teach, and a testament to the power of careful scholarship to reveal truths that had been hidden for generations. Today, the Whitmore Daguerreotype hangs in the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., where thousands of visitors encounter Samuel's story every year. Beside the photograph is a quote from his 1871 congressional testimony. "I am a man, and no mark can change that." The discovery has fundamentally changed how historians approach the visual documentation of slavery, leading to new research methods and countless additional discoveries. But more importantly, it has ensured that Samuel Johnson's voice continues to speak across the centuries, reminding us that behind every historical statistic was a real person with hopes, dreams, and an unbreakable spirit. Dorothy Williams, now in her 80s, often visits the museum to see her great-great-grandfather's photograph. She brings her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, making sure they understand that they are descendants not just of a victim of slavery, but of a survivor who refused to let his humanity be diminished by the marks burned into his flesh. Samuel's legacy lives on, not just in the photograph, but in the family he built, the testimony he gave, and the countless people who have learned from his story. The brands that were meant to mark him as property have instead become symbols of human resilience and the power of truth to transcend even the darkest chapters of history. The research continues, with new discoveries emerging regularly from archives around the world. Each photograph analyzed, each document digitized, each story recovered adds to our understanding of slavery's reality and its lasting impact. Samuel's voice, speaking from 1871, continues to guide this work. I survived to tell this story so that people will know what slavery really was. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others. Samuel's story deserves to be remembered, and your support helps us continue bringing these important historical discoveries to light. History has the power to teach us, to inspire us, and to remind us of our shared humanity, but only if we take the time to listen to the voices of those who came before us. What other hidden stories might be waiting to be discovered in the archives of history? The past has more to teach us than we might imagine, and every photograph, every document, every preserved voice has the potential to change our understanding of who we are and where we came from.